In this lesson, we're going to break down and demystify how to paint something to look three-dimensional. This technique in painting is often spoken of in reverent tones, that something looks so real you could pick it up with your hands. Believe me, this ability is not magic and it is not out of your reach, especially now that you've developed some of your skills with value. Once you understand when to use highlights and shadows correctly, your subject will appear to have volume and occupy 3 dimensions in space. Flatness is the default to any painting as you're battling against the flat 2D surface of the picture plane. Don't be afraid to use strong contrast to show convincing volume. After you break down highlights and shadows into their respective values, you can create 3-dimensional volume in your paintings. Now, I promised that creating 3-dimensionality in your paintings would be easy, and it will be, but it actually took Western art tens of thousands of years to develop techniques to show depth and volume convincingly with paint. Early civilizations generally created 2-dimensional paintings. The Egyptians probably did flatness the best, exaggerating flatness with poses and compositions. Artists flirted with shadow and depth with some intriguing Roman wall paintings around 300 BCE. Hints of depth began to develop gradually over the next few hundred years, with artists paying closer attention to line quality and composition. But it wasn't until 1300 years later when artists began studying volume and depth in earnest. Some of this shift was due to material changes. When oil paints were developed during the Renaissance, its slow drying time gave artists a lot more time to blend and practice subtle shading and highlights. Dutch still life painting achieved incredible detail and volume in the 17th century. And artists like Caravaggio and Rembrandt continued to pursue depth and form through dramatic lighting and intense personal scenes. Manet, Matisse, Cézanne, and Picasso began to reject traditional volume in favor of exaggerating flat planes. Modernism eschewed tradition for emotion, perception, and concept. From then on, artists felt freer to choose when to use volume and when to paint something purposefully flat. This is a choice you will have too as you develop your artistic tastes and visions, but first, you need to learn how to create convincing volume. To create volume or 3-dimensionality, it's important to understand how light hits an object, moves across its surface, and then falls off. The first thing you need to figure out is where your light source is coming from, its angle, and how bright it is. The shape of your light source is also going to affect the highlight. On a reflective surface, you can see the shape and sometimes the color temperature of the light source, whether it's a window or a lamp or the sun. Knowing your light source will tell you how to paint it. With a single light source, it's helpful to generalize your object to a light side and a dark side. All objects affected by a single light source will have their light sides on the same side. To figure out how light relates to volume, let's turn to my personal favorite, the theoretical sphere in space. The part of your object closest to the light is going to be the brightest. The further away it is from the light, the darker it gets. Within the highlight area, you will often have a highlight, a medium light, and a low light before it begins to transition into a shadow. On a reflective surface, you will have a specular highlight, a particularly bright and small reflection that is the brightest and whitest spot. There are 2 basic types of shadows. A shadow on an object is called a form shadow. The shadow cast onto the floor or other objects by an object blocking the light is called a cast shadow. Remember, there isn't anything that can generate a shadow. Shadows are only created by the absence of light. Wherever a source of light is blocked, there will be a shadow. A form shadow will have a core shadow at its darkest, a dark middle tone surrounding the core shadow, and depending on how light the surface is, light will bounce off the table and hit the bottom of the object and you will see reflected light. Cast shadow parts get their names from astronomy, the umbra, penumbra, and antumbra. That may be the last time you hear me use those terms. The cast shadow is at its darkest and sharpest nearest the subject. The further away the shadow is from the subject, the more ambient light begins to lighten the shadow and blur its edge. It is important to understand the direction of your light source to understand the shadow. If your light source is directly above, as at high noon, you will have very short cast shadows. A light source from the side, such as sunrise or sunset, quickly flow the years, will give you very long shadows. Most typically, a light source will be at an angle, somewhere between overhead and sideways. There is also the usually reserved for Halloween light from below. This casts shadows upwards onto walls and ceilings. Light from below can often create the most interesting and unexpected shadows. Round objects have the most complicated highlights and shadows. Geometric objects with flat planes are a little simpler. The plane closest to the light source will be the brightest plane. Each plane will have their own value, with the plane furthest away from the light source being the darkest. Depending on the size of the plane, the value of each plane will be somewhat consistent, but it will be slightly lighter on the side closest to the light source and slightly darker on the side furthest from the light source. As you start developing your volume and dimension skills, I suggest you start in an environment where you can control the light source. Most things you encounter out in the world will have more than one light source, which creates multiple highlights and multiple cast shadows. Other light sources may be too diffused or undefined. In these scenarios, you won't encounter very dark shadows or highlights, and it takes much more careful discernment to see and record subtle differences in value. That's why, especially when practicing light and shadow, using dramatic lighting will be so much easier to create convincing volume. A dark room with a single lamp or flashlight can create nice, deep, dark shadows, which will help clearly define your subject in 3 dimensions. Let's try it out.